Something happened at the very first race of the 2026 Formula One season, and it has already triggered a massive controversy. The Australian Grand Prix was supposed to launch a new era of Formula One. New engines, new hybrid systems, new rules designed to make the sport faster, smarter, and more exciting. But instead, the race in Melbourne may have exposed a serious problem. Because immediately after the Grand Prix ended, several Formula One drivers exploded with criticism toward the FIA. Drivers are calling the racing chaotic. They are calling the new systems artificial. And some are even warning that the new regulations could eventually lead to a major accident if nothing changes. During the race, drivers reported closing speeds between cars of 30 to 50 kilometers per hour, simply because one car was deploying full electrical power while another was saving battery. In Formula One, that kind of speed difference is enormous. It can turn a normal overtake into a completely unpredictable moment. Lando Norris described the race as chaos and said the racing felt very artificial. Max Verstappen went even further, saying the new direction of Formula One feels more like Formula E with steroids than traditional racing. And suddenly, after just one race of the season, the entire paddock is asking the same question. Did the FIA push these new regulations too far? Because teams have already invested hundreds of millions of dollars developing these cars. Manufacturers built completely new hybrid engines around this concept. And yet, after only one Grand Prix, the drivers themselves are openly questioning the future of the sport. So what exactly happened in Melbourne? Why are drivers warning about dangerous speed differences? And why is the FIA suddenly under massive pressure after just one race of the 2026 season? Because once you understand what drivers experienced inside the cockpit during the Australian Grand Prix, you will see why this controversy could become one of the biggest rule debates in modern Formula One. After the chaos of the Australian Grand Prix, the criticism from drivers did not take long to explode. Because once the race ended and the drivers stepped out of their cars, the same complaints started appearing again and again. The racing no longer felt natural. Not because the cars were slow, not because the drivers lacked skill, but because the new energy systems were controlling too much of what was happening on track. Under the 2026 regulations, the electrical side of the power unit now plays a much bigger role in the car's performance. That means drivers must constantly think about battery levels, deployment strategies, and energy recovery, instead of simply pushing flat out every lap. And this is exactly what created the strange racing patterns we saw in Melbourne. Cars overtaking each other on one straight, then losing the position again on the next one. Not because of driving mistakes, but because the energy deployment cycles kept changing from corner to corner. For many drivers, this makes the racing feel artificial. Lando Norris was one of the most direct voices after the race. He said the race felt chaotic, and that the constant changes in speed depending on battery deployment made the situation unpredictable even for the drivers themselves. Sometimes, he explained, another car could suddenly arrive with a huge speed advantage simply because the power unit decided to release more electrical energy at that moment. In other words, the difference was not always about driver skill. Sometimes it was about energy timing. And that is where the biggest safety concern appears. Because when one driver is saving battery while another is deploying full electrical power, the closing speed between the two cars can become extremely large. During the Australian Grand Prix, drivers reported differences of 30, 40, even 50 kilometers per hour between cars approaching the same corner. At Formula One speeds, that kind of difference leaves very little time to react. Which is why Norris warned that if the situation continues, the sport could eventually face a serious accident. Because drivers may suddenly find another car arriving much faster than expected. And at those speeds, even a small misjudgment can have huge consequences. Max Verstappen has also been warning about these issues long before the season even started. When the 2026 regulations were first announced, he questioned whether the direction of the sport was moving too far toward energy management instead of pure racing. After the race in Melbourne, he repeated that criticism. According to Verstappen, the new cars force drivers to constantly manage battery levels and energy deployment, instead of focusing purely on attacking the lap. He even compared the concept to something closer to Formula E, a category where energy strategy is a central part of racing. For drivers who built their careers pushing the fastest cars in the world to the absolute limit, that change is difficult to accept. And after what happened in Australia, the debate around these new rules is now growing much louder. Because if the problems drivers experienced in Melbourne continue during the next races, the pressure on the FIA to respond will increase very quickly. But the energy system was not the only issue drivers complained about after the Australian Grand Prix. Because once the race was analyzed more carefully, another concern began to appear. The character of the cars themselves. Under the new 2026 regulations, Formula One cars have less aerodynamic grip than previous generations. At the same time, the hybrid systems have become more complex, which means the cars depend much more on electrical power to maintain their performance. For drivers, that combination changes the entire feeling of the car. Less downforce in fast corners, more dependence on energy deployment, and a car that sometimes behaves differently depending on how the battery is being used in that moment. Several drivers explained that this creates a strange rhythm during the lap. Instead of attacking every corner at full speed, they are constantly thinking about how much energy remains in the battery, when to deploy it, when to recharge it, and when to slow down slightly just to keep the system balanced. Lewis Hamilton has spoken about this concern even before the season started. He explained that some simulations suggested drivers might need to lift off the throttle much earlier before certain corners simply to manage the energy correctly. For a Formula One driver, that feels completely unnatural, because the entire philosophy of the sport has always been simple. Push the car to the absolute limit. Brake as late as possible. Accelerate as early as possible. But with the new rules, that rhythm is changing. Drivers are sometimes forced to lift early and coast into corners to recover energy. And when that happens, the cars behind may suddenly arrive much faster, which again creates those dangerous closing speeds that worried so many drivers in Melbourne. Nico Hülkenberg raised another important concern about the behavior of the cars. According to him, the new regulations reduce aerodynamic grip, especially in high-speed corners. That means the cars may feel less stable when pushing at the limit. And when you combine that with heavier cars and complex energy systems, the result can be a machine that feels very different from the Formula One cars drivers have been used to for years. That is why several drivers describe the change as drastic. Not just a small evolution, but a fundamental shift in how the cars behave on track. For veterans like Fernando Alonso, this raises a deeper question. If the regulations create racing where overtakes depend more on battery deployment than on driver skill, the quality of wheel-to-wheel battles could suffer. Drivers may overtake using extra energy on one straight, only to lose the position again on the next straight once that energy disappears. Instead of clean overtakes, races could become a sequence of repeated passes and counter passes. For some fans that might look exciting, but for drivers, it feels artificial. And this is exactly why the FIA now finds itself in such a difficult situation. Because the 2026 regulations were designed to define the future of Formula One for many years. Teams have invested hundreds of millions developing these cars. Manufacturers built completely new hybrid engines around this concept, which means large changes to the rules are almost impossible right now. However, smaller adjustments may still happen. Software limits, energy deployment restrictions, or technical directives designed to reduce the most extreme situations. For the moment, the FIA is carefully reviewing what happened during the Australian Grand Prix, studying the data, analyzing the speed differences, looking at how the new systems behave during real racing conditions. Because the governing body knows that if the problems drivers experienced in Melbourne continue in the next races, the pressure to act will become impossible to ignore. And this is where the situation becomes even more complicated for the FIA. Because the debate is no longer only about performance. It is about the identity of Formula One itself. For decades, Formula One has been built around a very clear philosophy. The fastest drivers in the world. Driving the fastest machines. Pushing at the absolute limit of what is physically possible. Every lap. Every corner. But the new 2026 regulations introduce a different philosophy. A Formula One car that is not only about speed, but about efficiency, energy management, hybrid optimization. From a technological point of view, that is extremely impressive. But from the driver's point of view, it can feel very different. Instead of attacking every corner flat out, drivers sometimes need to think about energy recovery, battery deployment, lift and coast techniques. And when that happens, the rhythm of racing changes completely. Max Verstappen has repeatedly warned about this direction. According to him, the cars risk becoming more like complex energy management machines rather than pure racing machines. Drivers are constantly looking at battery levels, adjusting deployment modes, and managing systems that sometimes feel outside their direct control. That is why Verstappen described the concept as something closer to a Formula E style system, rather than traditional Formula One racing. For many drivers, that comparison says everything. Because Formula One has always been about pushing the limits of performance. Not about conserving energy. Not about lifting early before corners. And yet that is exactly what some drivers had to do during the Australian Grand Prix. especially on a circuit like Albert Park, where there are relatively few heavy braking zones to recharge the battery naturally. In those situations, drivers are forced to recover energy in other ways, which means lifting earlier, coasting into corners, or sacrificing speed in certain parts of the lap. All of this creates a very different racing dynamic, and it explains why some drivers describe the race in Melbourne as chaotic. Not chaotic because of crashes or mistakes, but chaotic because the cars themselves were constantly changing behavior depending on how the energy systems were working. For the FIA, this creates a very delicate situation, because the new regulations were not designed only for 2026. They were designed to define the direction of Formula One for many years. Manufacturers like Audi and Ford joined the sport partly because of this new hybrid concept. Teams have already spent enormous amounts of money developing these cars, which means rewriting the regulations now would be almost impossible. At the same time, ignoring the concerns of the drivers would also be risky, because drivers are the ones experiencing the cars directly. They are the first to notice when something feels unsafe, or when the racing dynamic begins to change in ways that may not be healthy for the sport. That is why the next few races of the 2026 season will be extremely important. The FIA will be studying everything very carefully. Speed differences, energy deployment patterns, how often drivers are forced to lift and coast, how the overtaking systems behave during real racing situations. If the chaotic situations we saw in Australia start appearing again and again, the governing body may have no choice but to introduce adjustments. Not massive rule changes, but small technical directives, limits on energy deployment, software modifications, or adjustments to the overtaking systems. Because if there is one thing Formula One history has shown many times, it is that the first race of a new era often reveals problems nobody fully expected. And the Australian Grand Prix may have been exactly that. The first real glimpse of how the 2026 regulations behave in a real race. Now the question the entire paddock is asking is simple. Was Melbourne just a chaotic beginning to a new era? Or was it the first warning sign that the rules of Formula One may need to change sooner than anyone expected?